Chapter 1. The New Start. Catherine and her husband, Mark, had always dreamed of leaving the city for a quieter life. When they found a charming, secluded house in the small town of Ravenwood, they thought their dream had come true. The house, an old Victorian with ivy-covered walls, was surrounded by dense woods that promised tranquility and a fresh start. The locals were friendly, but there was an air of mystery about them. Whenever Catherine mentioned the woods, their faces would change. "Best to stay out of those woods," they would say. "Strange things happen in there." Catherine laughed it off. Surely it was just small-town superstition. Their new neighbors, the Wilsons, were a pleasant elderly couple who had lived in Ravenwood their whole lives. They invited Catherine and Mark over for tea on their first day. The Wilsons' house was cozy and filled with antique furniture, each piece seemingly telling a story of its own. As they sipped tea and chatted, Mrs. Wilson's gaze kept drifting to the woods behind their house. "Why do you all seem so afraid of the woods?" Catherine finally asked. Mrs. Wilson hesitated, glancing at her husband. "It's not fear, dear," she said softly. "It's respect. The woods have a history." "A history?" Mark echoed, curious. "Many years ago, a young woman disappeared in those woods," Mr. Wilson said, his voice grave. "Some say her spirit still lingers." Catherine and Mark exchanged uneasy glances. The Wilsons' words added an air of mystery to their new home, but they were determined to make the best of it. Chapter 2. The First Night. On their first night in the new house, Catherine and Mark settled into their new bedroom. The house creaked and groaned as it settled, but it felt warm and inviting. As Catherine lay in bed, she noticed a soft whispering sound coming from the woods. She nudged Mark, who was already half asleep. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. "Hear what?" Mark mumbled. "Whispering," Catherine said, straining to listen. "It's just the wind," Mark replied, pulling the blanket over his head. "Go to sleep." But Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers were trying to tell her something. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, until she finally drifted off into a restless sleep filled with unsettling dreams of shadowy figures moving through the trees. The next morning, over breakfast, Catherine mentioned the whispering to Mark again. He shrugged it off, but she could see a hint of concern in his eyes. "Maybe it's just the wind playing tricks on us," he said, trying to reassure her. "Old houses and dense woods can create strange sounds." Mark decided to spend the day unpacking and organizing the house while Catherine took a stroll through their new neighborhood. As she walked, she couldn't help but notice how the townspeople seemed to avoid looking directly at the woods. It was as if there was an unspoken agreement to pretend they didn't exist. Chapter 3. The Strange Discovery. Determined to prove that there was nothing to fear, Catherine decided to explore the woods despite the warnings. She packed a small bag with water, a snack, and her phone, and set out on a sunny afternoon. The air was crisp, and the forest was alive with the sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves. As she walked deeper into the forest, the whispering grew louder. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. She followed the sound until she stumbled upon a clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an old, weathered stone circle, covered in strange symbols. Catherine felt a chill run down her spine. The stones seemed ancient, and the air around them felt thick and heavy. She reached out to touch one of the stones, and as her fingers brushed against the cold surface, the whispering suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening. She turned to leave, but realized she was lost. The trees seemed to have shifted, creating an impenetrable wall around her. Panic set in as she ran through the trees, desperately trying to find her way back home. Finally, after what felt like hours, she burst through the tree line and into her backyard. She collapsed onto the grass, her heart pounding. Mark rushed out of the house, worry etched on his face. "Where were you?" he demanded. I was so worried. The woods, Catherine gasped. I got lost. Mark helped her inside and made her a cup of tea to calm her nerves. You shouldn't go in there alone, he said gently. It's too easy to get disoriented. Chapter 4. The Unseen Presence. That night, the whispering was louder than ever. Catherine could barely sleep. She felt as though something was watching her from the woods. She tried to talk to Mark about it, but he dismissed her concerns. It's just your imagination, he said. There's nothing out there. But Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. She started to notice strange things around the house. Objects moved, doors left open, and cold spots that seemed to follow her. One evening, she found a set of old keys on the kitchen table, keys she had never seen before. She showed them to Mark, who frowned. Where did you find these? He asked. They were just sitting here, Catherine replied. Do you think they belong to the house? Maybe, Mark said, though he sounded unsure. But I've never seen them before. As the days passed, Catherine's unease grew. The whispering followed her everywhere, even during the day. She began to feel like she was losing her mind. She spent hours researching the history of their house and the town, but she found nothing about the woman who had disappeared or the stone circle in the woods. One afternoon, Catherine decided to visit the local library. The building was old, with tall, dusty shelves filled with books that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. She approached the librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes. Excuse me, Catherine said. Do you have any records about the history of Ravenwood? I'm particularly interested in the woods and any strange occurrences. The librarian's expression shifted subtly, a shadow crossing her face. We do have some old newspapers and town records, she said slowly. But be careful what you seek. Some things are best left in the past. Chapter 5. The Confrontation. One evening, Mark went into town to pick up some supplies, leaving Catherine alone in the house. As she sat in the living room, the whispering grew louder and louder until it was deafening. She covered her ears, but it didn't help. The whispers were inside her head now. Desperate for answers, she ran into the woods, following the whispers to the stone circle. As she approached, she saw a figure standing in the center. It was a woman, her face pale and eyes hollow. Her dress was tattered and dirty, and her hair hung in matted clumps around her face. Who are you? Catherine demanded, her voice trembling. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she pointed to the ground. Catherine looked down and saw a small, unmarked grave. She suddenly understood. The whispers were from the spirit of a woman buried here, trying to tell her something. The woman raised her hand, and Catherine felt an icy wind whip through the clearing. The spirit's eyes glowed with a cold, blue light. Catherine tried to move, but she was rooted to the spot. Please, Catherine begged. What do you want from me? The spirit's mouth opened, and a raspy voice filled the air. Help me find peace. Chapter 6. The Truth Unveiled. Mark returned home to find Catherine missing. He searched the house and the yard, calling her name, but there was no answer. Finally, he ventured into the woods, where he found her standing in the clearing, staring at the grave. Catherine, what are you doing out here? He asked, concerned. She's trying to tell us something, Catherine said, her voice trembling. Who? Mark asked. The woman buried here, Catherine replied. I think she was murdered. Mark's face went pale. Catherine, there's no one buried here. You're just tired and stressed. Let's go home. But Catherine refused to leave. She knelt beside the grave, digging with her bare hands. Mark tried to pull her away, but she was determined. Finally, she unearthed a small, rusted box. Inside were old letters and photographs, revealing the tragic story of a woman who had lived in their house many years ago. She had been murdered by her husband, who had buried her in the woods to hide his crime. The letters detailed the woman's life, her hopes and dreams, and the abuse she suffered at the hands of her husband. They spoke of her fear and her plans to escape, plans that were never realized. The last letter was a desperate plea for help, written just days before she disappeared. As Catherine read the letters, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. She realized that the spirit wouldn't rest until justice was served. She and Mark took the evidence to the local authorities, who reopened the case. The townspeople were shocked, but many admitted that they had always suspected something was wrong. Detective Harris, a grizzled veteran of the force, took a particular interest in the case. He spent hours with Catherine and Mark, poring over the letters and photographs. "This is a tragic story," he said, shaking his head. "But it might be enough to finally bring closure." Chapter 7: The Final Revelation. With the investigation reopened, the town of Ravenwood buzzed with activity. Detective Harris and his team scoured the woods and the old house, uncovering more pieces of the past. They found hidden compartments and secret passages within the house, leading to more evidence of the woman's tragic fate. One night, as Catherine and Mark were about to go to bed, the whispering returned. This time, it was accompanied by cold gusts of wind and flickering lights. The air grew thick with a foreboding presence. Catherine clutched Mark's arm. "She's here," she whispered, her voice trembling. The couple followed the whispers to the living room, where the temperature had dropped dramatically. There, in the center of the room, stood the ghostly figure of the woman. Her eyes, once hollow, now burned with a fierce intensity. "You promised to help me," the spirit whispered, her voice filled with sorrow and anger. "But it's too late." Before Catherine and Mark could react, the ghost lunged at them. The room plunged into darkness, and the couple felt an icy grip around their throats. They struggled, but it was as if the very air was against them. The spirit's rage was palpable, a whirlwind of grief and fury. Mark tried to shout, but no sound came out. Catherine reached for him, their fingers brushing briefly before they were pulled apart by an unseen force. The last thing Catherine saw was the woman's anguished face, a face twisted in eternal sorrow. When the police arrived the next morning, they found Catherine and Mark's lifeless bodies in the living room, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. The house was eerily silent. The whispering ceased. Detective Harris stood in the doorway, his face grim. "I should have seen this coming," he muttered to himself. The townspeople whispered of the curse of the Whispering Woods, a curse that claimed the lives of those who dared to uncover its secrets. The house remained empty, a haunted reminder of the dark history buried within its walls. Chapter 8: The Aftermath. Weeks turned into months, and the investigation into Catherine and Mark's deaths went cold. The townspeople avoided the house and the surrounding woods, their fear deepening with each passing day. The once lively and curious atmosphere of Ravenwood turned somber and cautious. Detective Harris couldn't shake the feeling of unfinished business. He spent countless hours reviewing the case files, poring over every detail. One evening, he decided to visit the house one last time. Armed with a flashlight and a heavy heart, he stepped into the now-abandoned house. The interior was eerily quiet. Dust had settled on the furniture, and cobwebs adorned the corners. Harris moved through the rooms, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. When he reached the living room, he stopped. The air felt different, charged with an unseen energy. Harris approached the spot where Catherine and Mark had died. He knelt down, examining the floor closely. There, barely visible, were the faint outlines of symbols, similar to those on the stones in the clearing. A chill ran down his spine. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Harris made his way to the stone circle in the woods. The whispering started as soon as he entered the forest, growing louder with each step. When he reached the clearing, he saw the stones, their symbols glowing faintly in the moonlight. Harris took a deep breath and knelt beside the unmarked grave. "I'm here to help," he said softly. "Tell me what you need." The air grew colder, and the whispering intensified. Harris felt a presence beside him. The spirit of the woman appeared, her eyes no longer filled with rage, but with a deep sadness. She pointed to the ground, where the grave lay. Harris began to dig, his hands trembling. He unearthed a small, ornate box. Inside were more letters and a locket containing a photograph of the woman and a small child. Tears filled his eyes as he read the letters, detailing the woman's love for her child and her desperate attempts to protect him from her abusive husband. "This was never about revenge," Harris whispered. "You wanted to protect your child." The spirit nodded, her expression softening. Harris felt a wave of sorrow and relief wash over him. He knew what he had to do. The next day, he took the letters and the locket to the local authorities, ensuring that the woman's story would be told and her memory honored. With the truth finally revealed, the whispering in the woods ceased. The townspeople held a memorial for the woman and her child, planting flowers around the grave. The house, once a place of fear and tragedy, began to feel lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. Though the house remained empty, it no longer carried the same ominous presence. It stood as a testament to the power of truth and the importance of honoring the past. And in the quiet of the night, the woods around it finally found peace.